All right, TJ, you start off with a distinction of information and knowledge, and you struggle with a clear definition of the two. But you believe there is something qualitatively different between things like we are here and our memories are reliable and what is our purpose, as opposed to like how to tie one's shoes or change a tire. Now, things like purpose and meaning are just your own constructions, and even though you're an atheist, things like morality, meaning, and purpose are all part of the old theistic mindset. And what you're trying to construct is what Nietzsche called a center of gravity without God. And that's the significance of the term God is dead. I think of it more like a grand narrative created by religion. You removed God, but the grand narrative is still there. The music is still playing, even though God is dead. Now, I can say that the purpose of a hammer is to hammer nails, because that's what hammers are designed to do. That was the intention of the designer of the hammer, but that's obviously not what you mean by purpose. You mean purpose in an objective sense, and that doesn't exist. Purpose and meaning are inherently subjective, but as far as you're concerned, the only subject need be you. What you're avoiding is exactly what the Bible told you to avoid, and that is to place yourself as the center of gravity, where God used to be. You can be Satan, and you can make your own value and meaning. You said it yourself, you're the sole barometer. Scientologists tell all sorts of horror stories about what will happen when you leave Scientology, and Christians tell all sorts of stories about what will happen when you leave the church. Right now, you're still in the church, but it seems you're starting to figure it out. You're in the secular narrative of the church. The reason I'm saying all this is that our memories are reliable is a question that makes sense, whereas what is our purpose does not make sense. And the only reason you would ever possibly entertain a question like what is our purpose is if you still entertained that idea of an external center of gravity. It's the dead hand of God, right? You're still asleep and it's time to wake up. The way to describe the dichotomy you're constructing, though, is with one word: theory. The question of how reliable your memories are is a matter of theory. You can test it, but testing a qualitative memory is difficult, because if you remember someone as being very warm around them and they have a nice smile, and then you meet them again and they don't seem as warm, what changed? You? The other person? Well, there's no way to be certain, except that we know a few things. One is that false memories and false emotions can be planted. That is, you can remember an event to be far more traumatic than it really is. Now, some therapists can plant completely false memories of being raped as a child, but what's happening now among a certain subset on YouTube is that people are implanting in themselves, through group reinforcement and amateur therapy, false emotional content in their childhoods. That is, by focusing on how events in their childhood made them feel, they begin to make their childhood out to be worse than it really was. And that's just an example of false. I don't know if you would call it a false memory or a false emotional content to the memory. But yeah, memory's very, very malleable. And second is that we tend to remember unusual things. Let's say, for example, you have a normal day for almost the entire day. It's fairly boring, but moderately enjoyable. And let's say, on total, the day is a 6 out of 10. Then at one point in the day, you scrape your knee and it hurts really bad and you're crying and sobbing and all that stuff. So what will you remember? Scraping your knee for that one instant, or the long, moderately happy day? You'll remember scraping your knee. That is, the past becomes caricatured because it is remembered as a series of unusual events, with the long, boring parts cut out, and so it is remembered as more dramatic than it really was. And I think that's people generally remember the past as being more dramatic than it really was, because what they remember are all the unusual parts, and so they remember it as a series of unusual, very dramatic events, forgetting the long periods of boring and slight happiness. Also prompts on recognizing the self as a perceptual construct, though your use of the word soul is a bit problematic for reasons you stated yourself. And I think that's also another sign that you're still in the church. And you also figured out that the self is just a model, right? And that the self is just a useful illusion. And that really impressed me. I didn't think you would be able to figure that out. My little pet theory is that the brain cannot calculate itself, but it can only model itself. How do I explain this? Okay. When you watch the behavior, I'll just use an example I used from my book. When you watch the behavior of an ant for a long time, you may not be able to apodictically predict all the ant's movements, how it moves around, but you've seen enough of the ant's movements to where you recognize that the ant is just a complex machine. That is, you can tell the ant behaves deterministically. Similarly, you may not know how a car engine works, but you do know that it behaves deterministically, and you can perceive it as such. Right? Even though you can't calculate it, you can calculate it enough to know that it's deterministically operating. But as you move up in complexity to, say, like a cat or a dog, then it becomes impossible for you to calculate. I mean, it's impossible for you to calculate a car engine, but it becomes so much more complex that you can't even perceive that a cat or a dog is a machine, and so you assume operational free will, but not entirely. You can roughly predict how a dog will react to certain things, but you can't predict the dog perfectly, and you can't predict the behavior of a dog as well as you can predict the behavior of an ant or a car engine. And to a lesser extent, you can predict how a person will behave, but again, not as well as you can predict how a dog will behave. And the fact that you can perceive a general nature of a person or a dog is the extent to which you can calculate the machine. And you can't calculate it all the way. So it's like people have this assumption of operational free will, but with tendencies. And to the extent they can spot the tendencies, to the extent they can calculate the deterministic machine. You can vaguely model how a person will react to something, but not with as much precision as you can model the behavior of a microwave. Anyway, I think consciousness is just the brain's model of itself that comes from a failure to calculate itself. Yeah, okay, I'll just end there. Then you contrasted information and knowledge. And when you did that, you were contrasting things like how a microwave works and how another human will react. That is, you're contrasting something apodictic with something you don't know completely. And so you must have some theory to explain it more generally, and that's what I got from your video. By information, you're talking about how a microwave works. By knowledge, you're talking about a theoretical understanding of things we are less certain about. But because you're still in the church, you're asking these non-cognitive questions like, what is the meaning or purpose to our existence? And you put this in the category of knowledge questions it's NA if you were out of the church. Other than that, as a mediocre video, it's one of your better ones.